Okay, quick show of hands. How many of you were between the age of 8 and maybe 18 between the years, say, 1955 to 1982? Were you between 8 and 18, somewhere between 1955 and 1982? Many of us were that age during that time. If you were between the age of 8 and 18, between the years of 1955 and 1982, you are extra blessed, and I'll tell you why. Because you grew up in a generation where Saturday afternoons were filled with both campy humor and horror. Sometimes it was Saturday afternoon, sometimes it might have been Friday after midnight, but all across this country between 1955 and 1982, there were these characters who showed up on television to host shows where they showed really terrible B movies, old horror movies from the 1930s, 40s, 50s, that sort of thing. No matter where you were in America, you might have had one of these campy hosts coming into your rec room or your living room on a Saturday afternoon. For me, for my generation, growing up in the 1970s in southwestern Ontario, we had a character named Sir Graves Ghastly. Yeah, he covered the Detroit, Windsor area, southwestern Ontario, and he came on Saturday afternoons. Sir Graves was really from Euclid, Ohio, a suburb of Cleveland, but we saw him up in Windsor, Detroit. In the afternoon when his show came on, the screen went dark, and then you'd hear kind of a cat screeching, and maybe a wolf howling as fog and mist tumbled out onto the set, and the set was really a makeshift crypt, like you were in a mausoleum in a cemetery. And inside the crypt there was candles burning, and there was an old cloth casket sitting on two sawhorses, and you'd maybe hear some pipe organ music, and as the camera zoomed in on that casket, you'd hear somebody grumbling from inside the casket, grumbling like they had to go down the basement to get something and then come back up. And then at the perfect moment, that casket would open up. And Sir Graves Ghastly would sit up in that casket. He was a homely, silly-looking character who was half Svengali with a mustache and goatee beard and half Dracula. Some campy character who'd sit up in his casket and have some sort of bad joke to start the show off with. He'd say something about having to dust his cat off, and that's why he was running late. And then after he'd give you this kind of pun or campy joke, he'd have this crazy laugh and go, "It's Sir Graves Ghastly, and today's feature," and he'd tell you all about the movie you were about to watch. Now, if you weren't in the Detroit, Windsor area, you might have been in the Northeast Ohio region where you got to see the Ghoul. The Ghoul was the hipster of camp, and before him, there was Ghoulardi. Beth was shaking her head back there saying, "It's not the Ghoul, it's Ghoulardi." But people from Cleveland and Northeast Ohio got to see both of these campy characters. In fact, now that I've mentioned Ghoulardi, I'm sorry my friend Kenny is streaming at his own church today, because he'd be jumping up and down with excitement that I mentioned Ghoulardi in a sermon. Now, if you were from Indianapolis, where I spent a year of my youth, you got to see a guy named Sammy Terry, as in cemetery. He was really terrible, but he showed really bad movies, and at that age, we loved it. If you're from Georgia, you maybe get to see a character called Dooley. I think it was called Bestoink Dooley. Some of you may remember. I'm looking to see if Chris remembers Bestoink Dooley. He was from Atlanta, and he had a campy show for Georgians here. And, of course, they all got their start from the Queen of Camp. Of course, isn't that the way that every good man gets a good start from a great woman? The Queen of Camp, Vampira from Los Angeles. And she came on television with this kind of campy horror show so early in the life of television, it's surprising. You can Google Vampira if you want. I think she came on the air in 1953, and then everybody followed suit. One thing all these campy show hosts held in common is the movies they showed on Saturday afternoon or perhaps after midnight on a Friday night. They were really bad B movies from the 30s, 40s, and 50s. You got to see titles like It Came from Outer Space, or Attack of the Giant Killer Tomatoes. Or, of course, my favorite was They Saved Hitler's Brain. These are bad movies that very few would watch, and they were just scary enough to keep a 10 or 11-year-old boy or girl's heart pounding, but not so scary that they'd turn the TV off and run and hide underneath mom and dad's bed. It was keeping us entertained on a Saturday afternoon or late into the night on a Friday night. Now, the reason I'm telling you about these kings and queen of camp is that at that time in my life, when I was 10 or 11, maybe 12 years of age, I went to church every single week. I went to church, I went to Sunday school. Some Sunday nights I went to youth group. It was a great place. That's where all my friends were. I had a really blessed experience growing up at the Glenwood United Church in Windsor, Ontario. And I was so excited one Sunday when my Sunday school teacher, Mr. Rattray, told us the story of Ezekiel. It sounded to me very much like the sort of movie you might see on Sir Graves' Gasoline on a Saturday afternoon. See, the story is about this prophet named Ezekiel. And God puts Ezekiel in the middle of this valley filled with dry bones. If you're 11 or 12 years of age, that's a pretty creepy thought, to be stuck in a valley full of dried human bones. And by the power of God's word, Ezekiel tells these bones to join together, to connect, and they do. Those bones start to shake, and the scriptures say the bones start to rattle, and they started connecting bone on bone. But you know, bone on bone can be pretty painful experience. Any of you have had a knee operation, you know exactly what I'm talking about. So not only did the bones connect together, the bones started getting sinew between them, and sinew with joints and tendons to connect them all. And not only did they get sinew and joints and tendons, God said to Ezekiel, command the bones to have flesh. And then, like some 1999 mummy movie, if you saw it, the thing starts growing flesh, and their bodies start getting covered in skin. And then God says to Ezekiel, Ezekiel, call the four winds from all places in the earth, and those four winds will breathe life into these zombies, these bodies, so that they can stand up and start walking. And that's exactly what I saw in my 11 or 12-year-old mind, was these bones that got connected, and sinew and flesh and breath, and now they're walking like zombies. And on the way home from church that day, I'm saying to my parents, you know what? That story about Ezekiel would make an awesome horror flick. Imagine my parents were thinking, what on earth is this kid learning in Sunday school? And I said, well, think about it. First of all, the main character's name is Ezekiel. I know, really bad, but it worked for an 11. And you know what? Sir Graves Gasley would have loved it. Yeah. Ezekiel, and he commands the power of God. I mean, what greater power is this? And even the name of the story would have been an awesome title for a movie, a B movie, a horror movie on Saturday afternoon. Ezekiel in the Valley of the Dry Bones. I would have loved it. Certainly kept me interested as a kid, learning about God's Word and the power of God's Word. But let me tell you, it wasn't until maybe 5 years later, when I was 17 years of age, and I started going to confirmation class, a time in a person's life when they've been baptized, and now are going to make the commitment for themselves as a young adult. And I heard the story of Ezekiel and the Valley of the Dry Bones in a brand new way. In my mind's eye now, I'd seen pictures in my history books at school of the mass graves outside of concentration camps in Poland and Germany. I'd seen other images of real despair in my life. And in confirmation class, I learned what that story was really all about. You see, 600 years before even Jesus came on the scene, 25,000 Jews had been violently forced out of their homeland, driven out of Judah to live as exiles in Babylon. They were sheltered in place, so to speak, in a foreign land. They were strangers in a strange land, violently, forcefully driven from their home. 75,000 of them stayed in Judah, and they were sheltered in place in what was once their homeland, but now was being occupied by a foreign power. They were pressed down under the heavy weight of a foreign, invading, occupying power, Babylon. Their temple, the place that was so vital to them, so important, was destroyed. This was King Solomon's temple. It was impressive. It was massive, and they destroyed it. I was thinking, we may be feeling a little bit like Ezekiel's people, like those people living in exile these days, sheltered in place. Some of us sheltered in place that is foreign, a place that's foreign to us, not our own home. I'm thinking about Elizabeth, who's a flight attendant, and she has to be sheltered in place in New York City, of all places. Her home's here in Savannah, Georgia. Some of us are sheltered in place here in your own homes, whether you're in your own home in Canada or Ohio or Georgia or Tanzania or in Italy. And you know what it is. We're starting to learn what it is to be sheltered in place. It's a very stressful time. It's an uncertain time for us. We're living with a lot of uncertainty about our todays and our tomorrows. It's into that world that the voice of Ezekiel speaks to us from antiquity about the valley of the dry bones. And what we discover is that the valley of the dry bones isn't a horror story at all. It's a hope story. It's the story of a God who is so faithful to God's people that God will never abandon or forget God's people. Even if they're being sheltered in place in Babylon or Judah or anywhere else in the world, whether they're being sheltered in place by a foreign invading power, a military might like the Babylonians, or whether they're being sheltered in place by a foreign invading power like COVID-19. It's a story of hope, a God who will not abandon or forget God's people. God promises to breathe hope and to breathe that spirit of life into all God's people. And that's the promise that we have to hang our hats on today. I've been impressed that all across this country we're seeing the Spirit of God breathing hope and life and action into the lives of certain people. I think about those school bus drivers who continue to do their school bus route, not to pick kids up, but to drop lunches off, so the kids who are hungry get something to eat during this shutdown time. I'm thinking about some of you I know who are blogging online about your experience, getting downright poetic, and we need our artists and our poets right now to help us think creatively about the day and age in which we live. But we also need a vision of hope. We need to know what it's going to look like, not just 2 or 3 weeks from now, or even 2 or 3 months from now. We need to know what it's going to look like when it's all said and done. And that's where Ezekiel's vision comes into play for us. It's a vision of hope. It's a vision of a God who will breathe life into God's people once again. You know, there's an old hymn that says, I don't know about tomorrow, I just live from day to day. I don't know what tomorrow holds, but I know who holds tomorrow. We know, don't we? We know who holds our tomorrow. It's God who has our very names, says the prophet Isaiah, carved into the palm of his hand. God holds our tomorrow, and if God's holding our tomorrow, then tomorrow is a very good day. We got to do what we got to do right now, keeping our safe distance from one another, sheltering in place. We've got to stay connected online as best we can. We got to be careful not to bring each other down with a bunch of political vitriol, a bunch of hate comments online. We got to support one another, lift each other up. But we also have to keep an eye on the future, God's future. It's a promise that God will never forget us or abandon us, that tomorrow is very good because God is holding our tomorrow. Listen, when my daughter was about 4 or 5 years of age, she discovered this whole new genre of humor called knock-knock jokes. Every day I'd come home from work, she had a new one from me. Aren't you glad I didn't say banana? One of her favorites was one where she got to set me up, dear old Dad. And she'd say, Daddy, would you forget me if I went away for a week? And I'd say, no, I wouldn't forget you. Would you forget me if I went away for a year? You're my daughter. How could I forget you? Well, Daddy, would you forget me if I went away for a bazillion years? Although she swears today that she would never use the word bazillion even back then because it's not a real word. I said, a bazillion years? I'd never forget you. You're my daughter. I love you. Love is eternal. How could I forget you? Just when she knew she had me wrapped around her little finger, she'd say, knock, knock. And I'd say, who's there? And she'd say, Daddy, you forgot me already. Friends, the promise of the gospel is that even though we may forget sometimes, even though we may come up short, even though we may get frustrated or stressed with this sheltering in place, even though we may struggle with doubt or fear, even though we may forget sometimes, the promise that God made to us through Ezekiel, the promise that God made to us through Jesus Christ, the promise that God is making to us right now is this: I will never forget you. I will never forget you or forsake you. I will breathe my spirit, my breath, the ruach in Hebrew. I will breathe my breath into you, and you will live. Friends, I pray for you today. I know there's a lot of anxiety. I know there's a lot of uncertainty. I know that some of you are struggling with the sheltering in place. Some of you are still back there living in disbelief. Do we really need to keep our distance? The answer is yes. We need to keep our distance. But I also pray that while you're doing your part, that you also be blessed with hope. That God's Spirit fill you and strengthen you and bless you with peace each and every day. May God breathe on you the breath of God. Amen.